So, I could even hear that there was a microphone on now. I was a little bit nervous about it. I am also a little bit nervous today. It's the first time that we really try to have an event like this here, sort of in the lobby of the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. But I think we have a very interesting event coming up. The idea that we have today is somewhat different from what we have seen before. I allow myself also to be rather informal. I have not started with excellences and so on, and I apologize for that. But it is actually due to the embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the ideas that they had. What they wanted was, and the word is, informal. And that's why we are here. We're all very close. An informal discussion based on Europe, the European Union, the Euro. And when I look at it then, I think in the following way that it's pretty ideal then to have a representative standing here to the right of me, Frans Timmermans, the Foreign Minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, because what we have here, of course, with the Netherlands is a country that was there right from the beginning, forming back in the early 50s what is now the European Union, and also a country that was part of the founding fathers of the Euro. Right? So an ideal representative that we will have today, Foreign Minister, formerly Minister for Foreign Affairs, and with a long career in international politics. I would also say that it's ideal to have you here as the audience. We are in a place that, in terms of Europe, European Union, Euro, actually is quite diverse. Among you, there will be people who are from the European Union. There will be people who are not from the European Union. There will be some who are from the Eurozone, say Estonia. There will be some other of us who have almost both feet in there right now, at least from 2 months from now, namely Latvia. Then we will have a country like Lithuania, perhaps coming into the Eurozone from next year or the year after. And then we will have some for whom the euro most likely will be a foreign currency for a very long time or perhaps forever, right? And is that good or bad? Perhaps we will know a little bit more about that today, right? I'm here as the moderator of this little event, which means I don't have very much to do. I only take the blame for everything that goes wrong, right? The idea is that I will give the floor to the minister in just a minute from now. The minister will speak for some 15 to 20 minutes to sort of set the stage for our debate here. After that, I will open the floor for discussion. And it is not very nice to be, in favor of discrimination usually. But today we have discussed this with the Embassy of the Netherlands, we will put priority on students. Others will have the right to say something too, but students come first. In other words, dear students, challenge the minister after some 20 minutes after he has given his initial speech. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity to have a debate with you today on Europe. The advantage of working with an iPad is that you get these news alerts, and I just got the alert that Alice Munro won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Nobel Literature Prize, and I'm very excited about this because it's one of my favorite writers, and I would all urge you, now that she has the Nobel Prize for Literature, to read some of her short stories, which are very much about what Camus would have called the human condition, a very interesting way of looking at human relations with a lot of humanity, with a lot of understanding of difference, and a lot of cherishing difference as something that is not bad but good. And I think if there's one way of characterizing Europe in a positive way, is what the French would call vive la différence. We love our differences, and sometimes we are, when talking about European integration, a bit confused whether this difference is good or bad, or whether being a good European means that you need to get rid of the differences. And I find it intriguing to discuss this with your generation, which is also the generation of my two oldest kids, because you have a different take on the way things are organized and the things work in the world. And I'm so excited to find out what this actually will mean for European integration once you have the audacity to brush us aside and take things over. I think it's about time you started thinking about that, but this is something that needs to happen, and you shouldn't wait too long. I think your brain is structured by now differently because of the way you have learned, because of the instruments you use when learning. We were trained to find things. Finding things, the process of finding things in academia was the process of learning how to be an academic, of learning how to select, of how to discard, and how to come up with conclusions. Finding things, it's something that I learned with my own students at Utrecht University, is no longer the problem. You have the whole world at the tip of your fingers, quite literally. And this has changed the way I believe you think. I'm challenging you to react to this. I think if I look at the youngest people who work for me in my ministry, they think in terms of networks. They don't think in terms of hierarchies. And they are Europeans not because they take leave from their own culture, but because they can travel quite easily, mentally, via their computers and physically into other cultures without losing themselves. I find this one of the most exciting developments of this new world and of Europe specifically. We all now share the same language in Europe, which is bad English. Everybody speaks this wonderful bad English. We do it to such a great extent that even the English are now beginning to speak bad English, taking over the mistakes we make in their language, and thus creating a true European language. If you read a text in Brussels, in the Brussels administration, and it is written in English, you take it to an Englishman who doesn't know Brussels, they will say this is not English. But it is a new language which is based on English, which helps us communicate with each other. The only thing I'm worried about is that because we can so easily communicate with each other, that we might lose this very important edge of curiosity vis-a-vis the other guy's or the other person's culture. And that would be a great loss. Until now, the difference in culture is a great contribution to European society and is a great strength in Europe. I say this also in the context of the euro you mentioned, because this euro project, I think, when we introduced it in the Netherlands, was actually quite underestimated from a cultural or an emotional side. We thought the economics of the euro were clear, and the fact that these economics were so clear meant that we hardly needed to explain it to people. Furthermore, we had our own currency with a queen on it, etc., but this currency hadn't been an independent currency for a long, long time before the introduction of the euro, because it was completely bound by the Deutschmark. So the national sovereignty of the Netherlands vis-à-vis its currency lasted about 15 minutes between the moment a decision was taken by the Bundesbank in Frankfurt and the moment this decision was entirely adopted by the Dutch National Bank in Amsterdam. That took about 15 minutes. So that was the illusion of national sovereignty that lasted 15 minutes. But to ordinary people, losing the currency, which in fact didn't exist anymore, had a much profounder effect than I personally had anticipated. And this was for cultural reasons, because a currency is also part of who you are as a nation. And here I really want to share my experience, because Latvia is on the verge of joining this, what I call great currency and great contribution to stability and to peace and security in Europe, which the euro is. You know, take into account that for sometimes, especially for a country that has fought so hard for its freedom as Latvia, and that has not been that has not had its own destiny in its own hands for very long, the currency is also a symbol of that freedom, and we should understand this. And I hope we can convince not just the Latvian parliament, not just the Latvian government, but the Latvian population, that the euro has a right to be seen as a symbol of freedom along the lat or any other currency that is used in free Europe. And the euro, from our perspective, is a very strong currency because it allows us to truly use this great European market without being hampered by problems with currency exchange. If you talk to Dutch exporters, and that means talking to about 80% of our economy, if you talk to them, they say, well, what is the great advantage of the euro? It is that we don't have to calculate currency risk when we sell a product abroad within the eurozone, because 70% of our exports are within the Eurozone. So expanding the Eurozone is good for us because it it lowers the cost for our export to other countries. But it's also good for the countries who join the Euro, because I'm absolutely convinced that Latvia, where export is very important for your economy, will profit greatly from the fact that you don't have to calculate currency risk into your proposition when you try to sell goods to others or when you try and buy goods from elsewhere within the Eurozone. So I believe economically there is no argument. I think we can quickly agree that this is a wise decision. You could look at it from the stability of the euro. That's another question. And there again, I would argue that the long-term trend is positive. Yes, we have squandered many years because the euro sort of put people asleep, especially in those countries that needed structural reform. But because of the position of the euro, they could no longer apply the same formulas they had applied in the past, which was devaluation, and could therefore profit from monetary stability in another economy with different reform rates. So that we are now waking up to the fact that we made huge mistakes, and some countries are paying an extremely high price to adjust to new realities. But even without this currency, these realities sooner or later would have come and led to the necessity of economic reform in any country in Europe. Because what is driving reform is not the euro. What is driving the crisis is not the euro. What is driving the crisis is, of course, and I don't need to explain that here, the global financial crisis that started in 2008. But what is driving reform is the fact that this continent needs to adapt to a fundamentally new demographic paradigm, where we have a different structure of our society, where we have a different ratio between young and older people, where we have a different ratio between people in certain types of jobs. We will need more people than we have ourselves to fill the jobs that we have, and we will be left with a surplus of people, if we're not very careful, who cannot fill the jobs that we need to fill because they don't have the skills. So what Europe is facing is a structural reform to make sure that people who now don't get the skills are trained to get these skills, to make sure that our welfare state is sustainable because more people take more responsibility for their own surroundings, and to make sure that in this globally developing economy, Europe organizes itself with 500 million people in a way that makes us a competitor on the global scale with China, with India, with the United States and other parts of the world. I truly believe that in tomorrow's world, decisions about global organizations, which will have to be taken, will be taken with, at the most, 10 players, 12 players, the most 15 players at the table. And those will not be the old nation states of Europe. It will either be Europe as a whole, or Europe will not be at the table, or only with a token presence. So I truly believe that if you want to shape the future of this planet, and the challenges are incredible. They're both exciting, but also I'm sometimes awestruck by the dimension of the challenge we need to face, demographically, in terms of the environment, in terms of energy policy, in terms of relations with other continents, in terms of continued instability we will see in the wider Mediterranean for probably a generation. These are all incredible challenges. We can tackle them, but we can only tackle them as Europeans, with a European policy, with concentrated efforts at a European level. There is no way Europe can prevent the moral failure of the accidents at Lampedusa without having a European policy not directed at creating ever more difficult borders in Europe, but at creating prospects for the people who take the risk of drowning off the coast of Italy because they believe that the risk of staying where they are is bigger, because there's war where they are, because there's no economic opportunity where they are, because there's no food where they are. The only way of avoiding another Lampedusa tragedy is by creating opportunity elsewhere. And there's nobody else is going to do this apart from Europe and the United States. I don't see other parts of the world taking that responsibility in the short term. We will have to lead the way. So with all the thinking, let me finish on that, and then I'm looking forward to your questions. With all the talk about the Asian pivot by the United States, with all the talk about old and new Europe, with all the talk about Europe's time is gone, if you look at reality today, if you look at opportunity for tomorrow, this is Europe's day and age if we grasp the opportunity. But we will not be able to grasp the opportunity if we are caught in a false contradiction between being Europeans and being good nationals. If we are caught in that contradiction, we will hurt ourselves and we will lose our position nationally and in the world. I believe we need borders in Europe. We need borders in our heads. We need borders between our nations. We need borders between our cultures because it helps us define who we are. But defining who we are does not mean that we can do away with borders in other areas, borders in foreign policy, borders in economic policy, borders in monetary policy. We need to do away with those borders, not because we will have to become sort of a new genus, a new form of life called European. Being Europe, I am not less Dutch because I'm European. You're not less Latvian. You're not less Estonian. You're not less German or whatever you are because you're European. You can only be a European because first you are Latvian. But the European identity is an added value in a world that is globalizing so fast that if we don't stick together as Europeans, others will decide about our future and not we ourselves. This is my testimony to why I am a committed European. And I will fight for this in every campaign I will still face. I will fight for this against a very skeptical public opinion in my country and elsewhere. I will fight for this because I think it is the right fight to fight. And I invite all of you to join me in this fight as fellow Europeans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. And certainly here a person where we could say there was no doubt in his heart about the commitment to Europe. What's it like here? I'd like to open the discussion. There should be some microphones. They are here. Again, as I said before, I would like to discriminate in the beginning, so I'd like to put emphasis on students. And I think I can mostly distinguish between students and others, right? So if you have a question, then please put up your hand. If you get the microphone, quickly give us your name and also your affiliation, where you're from, just so we know about it, right? So let's see. Over there, and Gita, we start over there. I will remember you till afterwards. And number 3, and yeah, very good.
So I can ask now.
Yeah. Name and where you're from.
My name is Ruming, so I'm from China. I'm definitely not European people. So my question is how to set up the standards fairly, because each country is different, and they have different rules and different culture. And how can we make sure those highly or well-developed countries won't be negatively influenced by those developing countries? Let's just take an example. In Sweden, there are some chemical substance or banned before they joined the European Union. But now some of them can be used because the Euro standards allow them to use. So how do you think about that? Thank you.
Let me start by asking a question to you. There's 1.3 billion people in China.
1.3 billion, yes.
Do they all share the same culture?
Many cultures different. Culture is different, of course.
Is that a problem?
But many cultures is the same. We have the same thinking. The way to think is mostly the same.
I think if I were to look from China to Europe, with all the differences we have in Europe amongst us, from Riga to Malta, from Amsterdam to Bari or whatever, looking at it from China, I think there's probably more in common in Europe than there is different. And I think the same would apply if we look at China. Looking from Europe to China, we think you are all the same. But if you travel to China and different parts of China, you see how big the differences are. Economically, culturally, in terms of development, in terms of income. You know, this is the modern age. We have to deal with these differences and imbalances. Are they always going to be dealt with easily? No. Are they going to lead to tensions? Yes. But that is the task of people like yourselves, to find ways of solving these tensions without creating stagnation, without people feeling left behind, without people getting the idea that they don't count and they don't have an influence. It's only the big ones. It's only the Germans. It's only the French. That is a big challenge for all of us. But you're absolutely right. These differences are making it sometimes more difficult to create common policy. But what would we be if we didn't have those differences? We would not be Europeans, because we need those differences to ascertain ourselves as individuals and within our community. I can only be active politically, I can only be performing economically if my two legs are standing firmly on the ground, and I can only stand firmly on the ground if I have no almost existential doubt about who I am. And I think the fact that people are insecure about this is not a result of European integration, but of rapid globalization. I think this creates more insecurity than European integration.
Good. Then if we get the microphone over here, you were second, yeah? So, yeah. And again, you know, name and...
Yeah, my name is Marie, and I'm from Denmark. And I have a question about your comments on Game of Thrones.
Yes. My Google Zeitgeist lecture, you mean? Yeah.
And there you're talking about winter's coming. And maybe I misunderstood, but I understood it as, you're talking example as financial crisis, the same as winter. And then now you are talking about that Europe, we have to be united to come through this crisis, but then you're also talking about wolves, that there are always some parts who will survive better. So who are the wolves? So what do you mean?
Well, I ended my lecture by one of the most beautiful quotes in Game of Thrones, is when a young lady discusses with her lover, who's called Jon Snow because he's the bastard son of a nobleman. Yes, I'm fully into Games of Thrones. And they discuss what the future will bring, and that they're into a battle, and that it's going to be difficult. And she answers him with this wonderful quote I shall never forget. When we die, but first we live. And that should be my motto, that should be our common motto. You know, this world is changing rapidly. We are seeing some fundamental paradigm shifts in the way the global economy is organized. We are seeing some fundamental paradigm shifts in power structures in the world. Europe is not going to be as dominant as it was in the past. Europe is only going to be one of the global players, no longer the global player that can, with the United States, determine the future of the world. That is scary. It is scary for us that our role will be smaller and different from the past. And reaction to fear can be, you know, you hide away, you cover your head, and you dream of a past that never was, and the hope that a future will come that will never be. That is what nationalists do in my country, and perhaps in Denmark as well, and in other countries as well. You know, they create a past that never was. They project that past on the future, and you'll project it on a future that will never be, because the future will never be like the past. Certainly in a past that never was. So my proposition to them is, winter is coming. It's going to be tough. We're going to have to adjust. We're going to have to change our social system. We're going to have to make some fundamental changes. But embrace that winter. Make sure that you're well-dressed, that you're all geared up to take the challenges and to create a better world. And with all the students I have met in the last couple of years as professor before I became a minister, nobody didn't want to take the challenge. They will take it in a different way. They have different ideas. That's good, because clash of ideas leads to the best ideas. But my winter is coming metaphor is to say, yes, I'm not predicting that everything will be hunky-dory and that we'll only eat cake every day. I'm saying that we'll have difficult times. But I'm also saying that your generation is the best equipped generation in European history to take these challenges and turn them into opportunities. Because I believe in you. I believe that you can make this world a better place and that you can do a lot better than my generation has done so far.
Good, thank you. And we need the microphone. But we need it for the live streaming. Please.
I'm going to shout. Is it okay?
Well, I'd rather you just talk.
Yeah. Okay, go
Shouting
ahead. Go
won't
ahead.
really.
So my name is Abduras. I come from Lithuania. First of all, I want to thank you for a wonderful speech. I thought it was brilliant rhetorically, but I want to challenge you on some substantive points because I'm
Go
not
ahead.
yet ready to join your fight for Europe.
Go ahead.
So on one hand, you are saying... Okay, so it's all right now, right? So on one hand, you're saying that all the arguments for euro and economic benefits that come from it are clear. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because on one hand, what you are saying is that, you know, companies are not going to need to exchange currencies, right? Or like people are not going to exchange currencies and it's going to be easier for them. But I think that they are very, very marginal benefits, because on the other hand, you have things such as surrendering monetary policy, yes, and you have things such as surrendering currency as a policy tool, because you can't appreciate it. And I think especially for developing countries, an extremely important tool, right? So how can you, not using rhetorical tricks, but answering on the substantive level, how can you prove that, these marginal benefits on one hand are more important than these other benefits that I've just mentioned?
Sure,
thank you.
Sure. And I thank you for not using rhetorical tricks, but putting a very straightforward question. The moment European nations chose to create an internal market, the only logical outcome in a globalizing world was then also to create a monetary union. If you don't want a monetary union, and that is something I always debate with the Brits because I fundamentally disagree with their point. In the UK, some people would say, not everyone yet, you can have an internal market and still have an independent currency policy. That's sort of your argument, and sometimes you need it. I think your argument is valid in some cases. In the case of Norway, I think it would be, given the oil-based economy of Norway, it would not make much sense to have Norway as part of a European currency, given the enormous excesses in their income that they need to save. That would not make much sense. But given the state of development of the European economies, even in the south, given their integration with the internal market, the old instrument of letting things get out of hand and then using inflation to correct it is going to get out of use anyway, given the structure of the economy. I grant you they could have done it for much longer without a common currency, but sooner or later, every economy in the internal market will have to face the fact that you cannot solve crises anymore by a single inflation within the internal market. Why? Because it will, if you get different currency policies within a fully integrated economy, which is now the internal market, you will disintegrate. You will disintegrate this economy out of tension because of the currency fluctuating so enormously. We had currency fluctuations in the past, in the 1980s specifically, when the previous socialist president of France thought he could have an expansionary monetary policy which failed within a year and a half and had to be corrected. That could be corrected. It didn't affect us very much because the economies at the time within Europe were hardly integrated or very little integrated. With the level of integration of our economies today, we can no longer afford in the long run to have this fundamental difference in monetary policy, the North just being for austerity, the South solving things by inflation. So your argument is valid that because of the euro, some states have lost policy instruments they had in the past and worked for them in the past. But my counter-argument would be, with or without the euro, sooner or later, given the level of integration of the economies within Europe, they would have lost this instrument anyway.
Very good. Then we have, I think you came first and you will be second, and you will be third. So the microphone goes here first, then it goes to Daniel afterwards, and then possibly back to Edgaras. Yeah.
My name is Rudolf. I'm from Latvia, and I wanted to ask how big the Eurozone and the European Union has to be to the Europe can make a mark in the world, to make an influence.
I think the question is no longer a question of size, since we are 500 million already now. And if you look at the potential enlargement of Europe, the European Union in the foreseeable future, this will not add many, many millions to the population, nor will it add substantially to the size of the European economy. I think we need to integrate the countries in the Western Balkans. We can't wait with that very long, because for political and geostrategic reasons, but for economic reasons it doesn't make much of a difference for Europe as a whole. I think what is necessary for the Eurozone or for Europe, it's probably a Freudian slip there, but what is necessary for Europe to get back at a higher level of performance vis-à-vis other parts of the world is to fundamentally solve the financial crisis problems by creating a banking union. I think this is a very concrete step we need to take. Once there is no insecurity about the situation of banks, the lifeline, the lifeline of the European economy, which is monetary circulation, will start again. At this stage, banks are afraid to, put their fate into the hands of other banks because they don't know where the guarantee is. Once you have this banking union, it's almost like a circulation of a blood system will get going again. I believe this is what Europe needs today. What we don't need today is being paralyzed for political reasons, and that happens in many countries. My optimism is based not on my generation, but especially on your generation, because I encounter very few people in your generation with a true sort of nationalistic hang-up. You're not believers in the European system in terms of you love Brussels or the Commission, not at all. But you are consumers of Europe as something that is part of your life, as a normal part of your life, and that's what I like a lot. You're not ideological about this, you're very pragmatic about this, but you're very ideological, you're very committed in terms of creating a better world. So I'm learning to understand you, and I hope that this understanding might help people of your generation to finally grasp the way power works in the world, because that is the only criticism I have of your generation. Let me be very frank of this. You are too comfortable with your present situation. This has changed in the South, where 60% of the young people are unemployed, and it's going to change elsewhere. But once you translate an increasing sense of discomfort into the will to be involved and to decide in the politics of your nation and this continent, then things will start going. But you are too disengaged from decision-making at the political level. That is my biggest concern about your generation.
Oops. The microphone then should go down to the bottom.
Yep.
Oh, you already have one. Yeah, very
Yep.
good.
My name is Daniel, and I'm from Moldova. So you told that economic reasons are like very, very good. But I want to question them. So let's look from this perspective. Theoretically, the authors...
For the euro, you mean, huh?
The European zone.
For the eurozone.
Yeah. Theoretically, it was expected that the growth in GDP of all these countries would be, for example, like initially rose and re-rose, told like 200%. But what we could see for the last two periods of time, it was like 1.8%. and 0.4%. And it was like 2005, 2008, and 2011. And it was comparatively less than its competitors, like, US, Australia, Japan. So how can you comment on that? Because, it's not as expected that going to Eurozone will bring economic benefit to the country.
Hey, listen, what I've learned since this crisis started in 2008 is that economics is a social science, not an exact science. Economists always have, as the Americans would say, 20/20 hindsight. And they're the best, to use another American metaphor, they are the absolute best Monday morning quarterbacks. So they will always explain afterwards why everybody else was wrong before. So I can never contradict when you say to me that all these predictions were wrong. They were wrong. Did people see the 2008 crisis coming? No. Should they have seen it coming? Of course. The world, there's this great, I think he's a Harvard professor, who's written this book, what's his name again? God, I'll come up with it soon. The book is called This Time is Different. I'm sure one of you in the audience will know his name. There's two authors. He has a Slavonic name, but I've forgotten it. I'll come up with it soon. But the book is called, remember that, the book is called This Time is Different. And these two authors analyzed hundreds of years of financial crises. And every financial crisis starts with people saying this time is different. And in essence, it's always the same. And that's why I'm saying economics is a social science. It is always based on hubris, on people taking too many risks, and then taking out too many loans, either publicly or privately. And this happened through the Middle Ages, and they had a good recipe to deleverage in the Middle Ages, because who did they get this money from? From the Jews. So what they did when they ran out of money, couldn't pay back the Jews, they started a pogrom, killed all the Jews, and they were rid of their... No, I'm not being cynical, it's history. That was, but the economics of this returning pattern is that through hubris, public bodies and private persons make too many debts. And then the debts need to be written off. And they are always written off on the public. In a modern tax system, it is quite clear how they're written off. In a traditional system where you had no taxes, they were written off simply by taxing the people physically at the spot. So the fact that this crisis happened is a constant fact in history. The fact that it happened on a global scale is a reflection of the fact that now our economy is globalized. There's no hiding from this anymore. You know that why was President Obama worried about Greece defaulting? Because if Greece were to default, his jobs would not increase and he would lose the election. That is how interconnected the world is today. And that is a fact of life we need to deal with. And this is more important than the Eurozone or the effects in the Eurozone. The other point I could make to you very briefly, you are right to say the Eurozone did not produce the effects that people had anticipated. But how could one prove the assumption that without the Eurozone, the effects on the states in Europe might have been far more catastrophic than with the Eurozone? That's my assumption. I can't prove it, but it is my assumption that if we did not have a euro and a Eurozone, speculation against individual countries within the Eurozone with certain weaknesses would have been huge, and many more countries might have then defaulted. You can challenge my statement, and you would probably be right, but you can't prove I'm wrong, and I can't prove I'm right. And that's the damn thing with economics.
Okay, I feel hit. I'm an economist, right?
Yes.
But
so you're a social scientist.
Yeah. But Ken Rogoff in common, right?
Ken Rogoff, that was it. Yes.
Then we take our chances here again, and then it goes to Gediminas afterwards, and you will be third. Yeah.
So it's me again.
Hi.
I want to challenge you on so many points, but I want to concentrate on one of the issues that I have. Like when you talk about this nationalistic sentiment that as the sole reason why people oppose Eurozone and an anti-European Union, I think you're kind of mischaracterizing the position, because on one hand that's true, but on the other hand I think the difference is more subtle, because you also have power differences in European Union. So for example, and there are various channels how they get transmitted, right? So for example, I think that if you take on one hand Germany, France, or like let's say Netherlands, and on the other hand you take Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, like nobody's gonna care about what the Baltic the countries want in terms of, let's say, monetary policy, or in terms of aid, or in terms of, like, other structural programs that, they need to implement. And I think that was also the problem with Greece, because Greece essentially, like, when it came to, post-crisis structural reforms and the stuff that they needed to implement, they had absolutely no say in that, and it was absolutely dictated by the heads of the European Union, such as Germany. So how do you explain that thing, and how do you essentially...
So you are now saying that I made a caricature of things? Let me challenge you on your caricature, if I may. I know that there's a feeling in my country and in Germany that we need to pay for people who retire at 50 and spend their days lazily on the beach with a bottle of ouzo and don't work. I know that there are images in Greece and other countries that we in the north love to tease people in the south with an austerity policy that is absolutely not necessary. First we made money off selling them stuff, and now we don't want to help them. But these are typical European. It's part of our history to think in those terms. We would not be Europeans without stereotypes. Let's be realistic. But I have a job challenging these stereotypes. I think a country like Germany, and Mrs. Merkel, she's not from my political background, a country like Germany, under the leadership of Mrs. Merkel, has taken on a great responsibility and has behaved extremely responsibly in this euro crisis. I have no criticism of the way the German government has behaved. So my first point to you would be, there is a strong realization by all nations in the Eurozone that we are into this boat together. Is this boat leaking? Absolutely. Does it help if we create our own small boat? Can we then leave? No, it will still leak. So we need collectively to fix the leaking boat. That is my first point. Secondly, if you're in the European Union, do big countries have a bigger voice than small countries? Absolutely. Absolutely. Is that logical? Absolutely. If you have a population of 83 million, do you get more to say in decision-making than, for instance, a population of 400,000 like Luxembourg? Yes. Why does Luxembourg traditionally always accept that? Because Luxembourg knows that it benefits from this situation economically, socially, and in terms of stability. My fundamental argument for Baltic EU membership is not because then Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania will have a greater say in certain affairs. It is that it gives these countries a fundamental security and stability that could not be gotten in any other way in long-term effect. If I look at a country which I like very much, which is Poland, for the first time in over a millennium, Polish borders are not something other nations play around with. For the first time in hundreds of years, Poland is a nation which knows that its borders are not disputed by its neighbors. This is worth so much more than the biggest cost of the biggest euro crisis. For the future of Europe, this is such a diamond, this is such a precious thing to have, that we should study it every day, we should enjoy it every day. Look at the greater responsibility Poland is taking for European affairs, for global affairs, because it is secure. And look at the way Polish culture, Polish society, Polish art is booming because of this effect. No, you will not, whatever, you are a very good orator. You have very strong points, and your points have some truth in them. I don't agree with your analysis, but you have very good points. But you will never get me off this fundamental position that the contribution of the EU and the enlargement of the EU to global security and to peace and prosperity for its population is so fundamental that whatever crisis happens, we need to face it because there is a greater good. Thank you.
Okay. Then we shift to down here to the left. So please.
Thanks. This works?
Yep.
So thanks for making this interactive. This is really nice, what you're doing.
And your name and where you're from.
I'm Gediminas, and I'm from Lithuania. I'm one of the students here. The thing is that Since we talk about today about this, how we need good development, how we need more cooperation between countries, and how we're all in the same boat together, right? So the question that I wanted to add to the agenda of what you're talking about today is that do you see that the EU is largely under threat in status quo from what we see now as the rise of the far right? In many countries, and even founder countries of EU, we see parties like Golden Dawn in Greece, but we also see UKIP, we see far-right parties in Italy and in France. And the second question under that is also, do you think that this needs some sort of an outside effect to those countries, that the EU should outreach to these countries, or should be left to deal with by themselves?
Thank you for your question. It is one of the most fascinating topics for a politician and an intellectual, if that's your line of work, to think about and to chew on, because the far right is part of who we are as Europeans. It is not foreign to our culture. It is part of our culture. The far right is based on partly on the idea I explained earlier of sort of recreating a past that never was to project it on a future that will never be. But it also has everything to do with the fact that the definition of who we are in Europe, more than in other parts of the world, is based on ethnicity, on the place where you were born, or the family, or the group you belong to. And the challenge to that, through the ages, has been interaction on a European scale. And this goes well and is accepted as long as there is no crisis. But once there is a crisis and people are afraid they lose their job, the traditional European reflex, who can we blame? And you always go looking for somebody to blame. And traditionally, it's always been the foreigner without or the foreigner within, the foreigner next door or the foreigner in your community. And traditionally, the ones who always got the blame traditionally were the Jews. Now we have new migrants we can blame, we have the rich people we can blame, we have the Eurocrats we can blame, but we always externalize the blame. That is the way for Europeans to deal with things. I'm not criticizing this, I'm trying to analyze it, because if you live in a society and you want to help solve the problems of the society, you have to be realistic about that society. So as much as I dislike the extreme right, and as much as I dislike xenophobia, as much as I dislike Islamophobia, as much as I dislike anti-Semitism, I also know it is part of our human nature. And culture is the way you find instruments and measures to deal with that part of human nature. And I believe the Council of Europe, the European Charter on Human Rights, the debate in culture, contribution by writers, artists and others, they are all an invitation to look at the world through the eyes of the other. And what we always need to remember as Europeans is that we can only be ourselves. We can only discover who we are as an individual and as a community if we allow ourselves to look at the world through the eyes of someone who is different. Europe prospers when it holds on to that capacity. Europe fails when it loses that capacity. And the danger of the extreme right is that it forces us to lose that capacity, because it forces us to constrict the world to us and to see everybody who's different as a threat to our world. That is why I'm really always fighting against the extreme right. Not because they don't belong in our society. They do, because they're part of who we are. But because I think their propositions are bad for our society and they need to be answered with sensible politics. Please.
Thank you so much for your speech. And interestingly, you were talking about integration.
And your name and where you're from.
Sorry. My name is Inga, and I come from Ukraine. So you were talking about integration and borders. You were talking about unity and diversity. And during your speech, you mentioned that we need those borders. So are we actually talking about territorial borders, cultural borders? And do you agree that culture is not static, it's dynamic, and it faces such challenges as globalization, for example? So are we actually talking about culture of single nation, or are we talking about the mix of cultures? And this is not the end.
Oh, more?
Yeah, just a little bit more.
Ukraine,
and
big country, big question.
And now we'll be talking from the future global integration perspective. So let's imagine that all of us share the same language, which is bad English. All of us share the same culture, because culture is a part of, the part of culture is values, and we all share common European values. All of us share the same currency, which is euro, and all of us share the same legal order with the support of European legislation. So how do we strengthen those borders? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Fascinating. The nature of borders is that they are dynamic. Geographical borders. Look through Europe's history. Is there any country you know that didn't have its borders tinkered with at some stage in European history? Cultural borders, they change all the time. Culture is dynamic. You know, my kids, when they're lazy and they don't want to do anything, they call for a pizza. My grandfather, I remember he visited us in Italy once. He said, "What is that? What strange bread is that?" If I say that to my kids, that my grandfather didn't know what a pizza was, you know, they laugh out loud. It's a very small example of how culture changes, how culture interacts. And there are many more examples we can give. But the issue is, if things are so dynamic and changing so quickly that people lose their foothold, that they lose the sense of belonging. You know, if you are in a room, you need some bearings. You need a floor, you need a wall, you need to be able to see where you are. And borders are necessary in that context. In that sense, there is always a border between you and me because I'm a different person. And there are more borders because I might have a different language or I might have a different culture. I'm from a different generation. My brain is structured in a different way than yours is in your generation. That is the sort of borders I talk about. I do this inspired by a French philosopher, Régis Debray, who's written a wonderful speech on borders, on the necessity we as humans have to have borders. But I say this not because... I say this not out of nationalism or out of extreme love for the nation state. I say this because we need our bearings. We need to have limits. We need to know who we are, where we are, if we are to be open to others. That is essentially my point. Now, the second element of your question is, can you still have that if you have one currency? Blah, 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 blah. Take China as an example, where there's one currency. There are still so many differences within Chinese society, within Chinese, globally speaking, culture, that so many cultural differences. Look at the United States, one nation, 50 states, but look at the differences within the United States. And it's dynamic. The United States is turning more and more Hispanic. That would not have been foreseen 2 generations ago. So it is exciting to see all these changes, and we have to make people understand that borders have always been and will always be dynamic, and at the same time, philosophically speaking, I think every human being needs borders to know who he or she is, and therefore to know his or her relationship with other human beings, be it on an individual level or on the level of communities. Sorry for being so philosophical.
Looking at the time, I think we can have one last question, and it could be coming from there. Yes, please. But it'll be the last one, and it should be relatively short.
Hello, my name is Ryan Parry. I'm actually a journalist with the Baltic Times. I'm just wondering if I could... I'm not a student, but could I...
The last question can be
it's a last question.
Non-student, yeah.
Very quickly, thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans, for a great speech. Your English is fantastic. Your accent is fantastic. I'm saying that as a Brit. So
yours is not bad either.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm trying. Something taking the headlines, obviously, as you know, is Latvia, or you could say Baltic-Russia relations. And you've probably obviously seen the recent trade sanctions placed on Lithuania. A question to you is, how do countries wanting to integrate with the European Union tackle pressure from countries like Russia, which do starve their economies and bully them, essentially?
I have two answers, two parts of an answer to your question. My first answer would be, this is a collective European responsibility. So if there's a trade dispute on the basis of Lithuanian products with Russia, you go to the trade commissioner in Brussels, Mr. de Gucht, and you tell him, we have a trade problem, please solve it. It's your responsibility. I think this should be not a bilateral debate between Lithuania and Russia. This should be a debate between the European Union and Russia. That is the first part of my answer. The second part is probably a bit more long-term and more fundamental. We all have our political traditions and our political backgrounds. I believe that in Russia very often there is still the belief that everything in politics is a zero-sum game. Either you win or you lose. One of the most beautiful and inspiring contributions of European integration to the world, out of sheer misery of our history, is that the Germans and the French, after trying 3 times in a row the zero-sum game and ending every time again in war, decided we need to create a structure that is based on win-win. And that is the essential element of European integration, this unique contribution in the world of politics, in the world of political history, that between nations that had been their enemies, each other's enemies for centuries, nations that had gone to war with about a rhythm of every 30 years, they came to this brilliant idea: what if we were to create such an interdependence between us that it's either win-win or lose-lose, but not win-lose, lose-win. I think if that sinks in all across the European continent, I think it would be a great benefit to Europe and a great benefit to Russia, because we need Russia as a strong and reliable partner on the European continent for the future of this continent, and Russia needs the European Union as a strong and reliable partner for its own future. That is my deep conviction. And thank you very much for this question. Thank you very much.
Yes, and with that question, given the time that we had, we will be winding down. The last person who asked the question actually took my sort of last comment away from me. I was also about to say that the minister here has claimed to be very European, but he's not perfectly European, right? Because he doesn't have this bad English, obviously. He has to practice on that, right?
I'll do my best.
Thank you very much to you in the audience also for coming here to challenge the minister. I hope he will really sort of remember that he was in Riga.
I
and he
really
got
enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much.
Tough questions, right?
You helped me.
Thank you very much to the Dutch Embassy for this idea, and a very big thanks to Gita Greenberger from the Stockholm School for organizing this. She spent very much time on that. And last but not least, obviously, thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you.